This is a content warning. This episode contains discussion of animal abuse. We have provided timestamps in the description for those who would rather avoid such content. Welcome back to History from Horseback. This is part 2 of our Bucephalus and Alexander the Great episode. If you haven't listened to part 1, you might want to pause, listen to that episode, and come back to this one. In part 1, we talked about the origin story of Bucephalus, as well as the husbandry and care of horses in ancient Greece. In today's episode, we are marching onto the battlefield to explore some of Alexander the Great's and his trusty steed Bucephalus's biggest battles. I was talking to Jay the other night about Bucephalus, and he has some strong opinions. And I was like, you should come on the podcast. He was like, no. But it's just so funny because he thinks Bucephalus sounds like an illness.
He's not wrong. It does.
I'm like, yeah, it does. So now he's
it also sounds like brachycephalic, which is like not
it
great.
It does. He hears me talking about him.
Here he comes.
I mean, I'm not saying anything that is false. He does think that Bucephalus sounds like an illness, and it does. I can't remember what he was calling him instead. It was like
brucellosis?
Like brucellosis.
That's a really good one. That's something that Australia does have that we dredge for, which is quite funny. But yeah, that's also a very good one.
Jay just texted me. He said he's a disease. He was saying that literally not only does his name sound like a disease, but he is the disease. So he wanted to spread across.
Oh yeah, that's fair.
Europe and Asia. Well, like the Middle East and Asia.
Yeah.
And you know what? I can't say he's wrong. You know when you get really tired and so you start getting kind of goofy? It was like those hours.
Yeah, it's like when you start getting like hysterical.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And then we were just talking about Bucephalus and Alexander the Great.
I can't talk to my wife about horse stuff. She just turns off her brain.
I mean, most of the time, Jay kind of does too. So I was surprised that he was engaging with me on this topic. Because this one is like a war episode. So, and I also find battles pretty interesting when I actually understand. Like when I imagine it like a movie rather than when it's just like a bunch of names that I don't know, or like when it gets overly complicated, I'm like, what? When we finished last time, the year was 334 BCE, and Alexander had begun his march against the Persians. Fighting the Persians would not be taken lightly, as it was no easy task. To understand what Alexander's forces would be up against, let's rewind to the reign of King Cyrus the Great. We could do an entire episode on the Achaemenid Empire and their dependency on horses. In fact, maybe we will eventually do an episode on them. Alexander certainly studied the Persians in depth, particularly the exploits of Cyrus the Great. Cyrus is generally recognized as the first ruler of the Achaemenid Empire and was responsible for a good amount of expansion of the empire. One factor that contributed to his military success was his cavalry. Cyrus was a fan of utilizing the speed and mobility of horses to his advantage. His cavalry primarily fought using archery and thrown javelins, making them effective at flanking the enemy and striking from a distance. Cyrus also used a cavalry of war chariots. While not as nimble or maneuverable as their mounted counterparts, chariots had charging power against infantry. War chariots and wagons were also used for the transportation of armor, weapons, and supplies. Of course, an army pulling chariots and wagons requires roads. Under multiple kings, the Achaemenid Empire developed a network of roads, bridges, canals, way stations, and post offices that stretched across roughly 1,600 miles. Called the Royal Road, This ancient highway was crucial to the commercial and military success of the Persians. Their relay system for carrying mail and messages was an early precursor to the U.S. Pony Express, capable of covering the entire distance in 7 to 14 days.
The war chariot, or the double chariot, was one of my favorite units in the original Age of Empires. Not that that has really anything to do with this. You couldn't play Persians in the first proper Age of Empires, which is very strange to me. Or you could probably play different types of them, but there was no civilization called the Persians to play. There was a whole Greek scenario that you could play against them. And a bunch of the big named heroes of that time. But the chariot units were always one of my personal favorites because, horse units are cool, but when you can put 2 horses on 1 unit, why wouldn't you? The more the merrier, I say.
You know what's weird is that I'm pretty sure there are Persians in Age of Empires 2.
Yes, there is. Yes. And they are quite good. Well, they're very defensive, but yes. Yeah,
which... It must be... I'm wondering if they're basing it off of the, Achaemenid Empire, or if they are basing it off of, a later empire or something, because this is so far before a lot of the other civilizations in that game. Because that game, really seems like Middle Ages. What?
I'm talking out of my ass that you can play them. I just couldn't remember. Now that I have remembered that, I do remember that you can play them because they have really, really, really good armored elephants. They're not quite as good as the Hittite ones, and they're not quite as good as the Carthaginian ones, but they are very, very good. Or not the Carthaginians, the Phoenicians. The Carthaginians are in the second game. But I do remember playing against Xerxes doing the whole Greek campaign, because the Greek campaign is the first one you do in the first game. So it's a bit off from this part, but yeah.
Which is so funny because the Persians didn't, at least the Achaemenid Empire, did not have war elephants. Okay, where were we? Oh yeah.
Where were we?
Talking about the Royal Road. Which I thought that the Royal Road is cool.
I think my only critique is maybe a more unique name would have been cool. The Silk Road was very cool, but in my list of roads that got famous names, I can't really complain, I suppose.
If you're the first Royal Road, then that's fine. It's just that it's not as original later down the line.
Mario Kart's not going to come for you for another 20-something years, right? And theirs was a rainbow road, so it's different, right?
As a Cyrus fanboy, Alexander knew all about the Persian cavalry and their common strategies. While Cyrus's rule was roughly 200 years before Alexander's time, the Achaemenid Empire still utilized bows with their cavalry. Knowing this, Alexander made careful plans to counter the Persian strategy. This, learning about all of this really made me appreciate, just with ancient history in general, it really made me appreciate how quickly things change nowadays. Yeah. In modern times, even in the past 200 years, the amount of change that there has been, both politically and also just in our lives, just as everyday technologies, versus in this where it's the Persians hadn't changed their war tactics in the last 200 years, because it had worked up to that point.
Yep. And now, every week, the US military buys a new jet type that you've never heard of before.
Exactly. Yeah, nowadays they'd be like, what? The iPhone was developed within a single person's lifetime? What? What
do you mean? Go back 200 years and people were still dying of dysentery.
I know. The amount of change we are used to is insane.
Yeah. So much so that we see it in our own lifetimes too. Because it's I have physically and mentally noticed my own attention span just turn into mud when TikTok became a thing. And that's only happened in the last year or so, but I've actively watched it happen and experienced it.
We discussed the companion cavalry last episode. As a horse podcast, we will focus a lot on Alexander's cavalry. But there were other important units in the Macedonian army. The companion cavalry was considered heavy cavalry at the time. intended to strike hard with their swords and zistons. Their horses wore armor, and they specialized in close combat. The prodromoi was a unit of light cavalry intended to move quickly for scouting ahead or delivering swift blows. They also used swords and zistons, but wore lighter leather armor and rode armorless horses. The infantry from Macedonia was primarily made up of the Greek phalanx. The thing is, there's a Pokemon that's called Phalanx.
Yeah.
And it's so hard for me to not say that.
Yeah, that's fair. I've always been a phalanx girly, but again,
phalanx.
It's just a fucking
phalanx. The infantry from Macedonia was primarily made up of the Greek phalanx. It was a heavy infantry armed with spears and interlocking shields. When the soldiers stood closely packed together and moved as one, the phalanx could become an impenetrable wall of death. As Alexander brought new forces into his army throughout his campaign, other fighting units were adopted into his troops, but the basic units I just described were the foundation for the Macedonian army.
Phalanxes, as seen on every Greek-themed war movie you've ever watched in your life.
Yeah.
Despite the fact that most phalanxes were only made with tower shields, not round shields.
Like they're interlocking shields. Yes.
Yeah, the interlocking tower shields, but movies will still show a phalanx made with round shields. And they do it in like this dome way that just absolutely would not have worked, because it would have meant that the guy standing in the center of the phalanx would have been like pointing his shield above his head with his arms up permanently. And like, how long can you do that before you get really tired? Like,
I think the Vikings might have done that. But again, those are the Vikings. Totally different. And it was like, that's, something they would do specifically against like arrow volleys, I think. Mm-hmm. But then if you're like marching against another infantry, you're not going to be doing that. There's no point.
Yeah, exactly.
So.
Also, big difference between round shield and tower shield. Tower shield is not something that you're like taking into battle like as a foot soldier intending on moving a lot. Tower shields were heavy and huge and cumbersome and awkward. Like, round shields were just as much about blocking arrows as they were about being thrown like a frisbee and used as a weapon, like an offensive weapon, or being hit with. You're watching a guy swing a tower shield with his arm, like, as an offensive weapon, probably not really gonna happen.
Yeah, like, really, at this time, like, cavalry were the ones who move quickly, who you use to move around, and infantry are not really all that mobile, but
they are your wall.
Yes, exactly, which is exactly how Alexander often used them, which I'll kind of talk about later on, of where they are the immovable object, and his cavalry is the unstoppable force. The first major battle between Alexander and the Persian army, led by General Memnon, was the Battle of Granicus in 334 BCE. Up to this point, Memnon's strategy had been to slowly retreat, destroying any provisions or supplies that could be utilized by the Macedonian army. This could have worked, as Alexander had packed light. His goal was to bring as little supplies as possible, not even bringing wagons, but instead moving everything on the backs of pack horses, so as to travel swiftly. However, Memnon was ordered by King Darius III to stop and fight Alexander on the banks of the Granicus River. Honestly, Alexander's entire campaign could have kind of been nipped in the bud, but it seems like King Darius kind of wanted a PR opportunity. So he was like, it doesn't look good for us to just be retreating this way. It's not badass. Stop and just fight him and crush him.
I suppose as well, like, when you have the number advantage, there's like an assumption, and like, not to like the 300 of Sparta anything or like bring it up because it's going to come up eventually. But like, when you have more soldiers than the other army, like most of the time you're gonna win. Like it was very rare for things like Spartans overpowering them or, winning with less people. It's like a once in a blue moon thing.
Right.
I think people think it happened a lot more than it did. It didn't. Your soldiers can be very, very well trained and take out a lot more of the enemy than they, get taken out themselves. But they will eventually get tired. And they will eventually be weary, and they eventually will not be able to fight at their best anymore. Unless they are fed well and rested well between fights, which when you're packing light is hard to do. So, yeah, I mean, fair call to stop and just say, you know what? Let's fight. Let's do it.
Yeah, like, Alexander really wasn't taken seriously at this point at all. Like, he's just some upstart kid who has a pretty small army compared to a lot of the other forces that he fights. And also, like, he's taking on a lot of empires that had already been in power for a while. So they were like, yeah, our system works. Our way of fighting works. I don't think they definitely didn't expect him to win.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like, as much as I've just gone through like an entire conversation about the fact that when you have more people, it's more likely that you'll win, and like winning with less people is a once in a blue moon thing, which is obviously what is about to happen here. But it just goes to show that he kind of knew what he was doing. Like he wasn't stupid about the way he fought these things, and he wasn't. Yeah, he was, again, like you said, like very underestimated.
Part of it was that he had really good timing. So one common theme that we'll see is that he has really good timing of when to charge with his different forces. But also, I'll talk about it a little bit more, but it's like he was kind of brazen in a lot of the ways he fought. He wasn't as cautious as you would expect from someone who has a limited amount of guys or that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So I feel like he would sometimes fight as though he had more people than he did. But part of that was because his soldiers were very well trained and very loyal to him. It was really common for there to be mercenaries or just kind of like loose allies fighting for you. Or even like, the army or the people in their different armies weren't necessarily like hand-trained, hand-picked. Like they're kind of conscripted dudes. And so they weren't necessarily all that loyal to their leader. They're fighting so that they can get a paycheck. They're fighting so that they can get like gold and loot and that sort of thing. They're fighting to get to travel in these times. So they're kind of loyal to themselves. And so that's something that takes some of these forces that he goes against by surprise, is just that Alexander's soldiers are often willing to like kind of sacrifice themselves for him, which is not the way that a lot of other cultures fought. Alexander's army was greatly outnumbered, with 40,000 soldiers to the Persian army's 100,000s. In addition, a river separated the two armies, giving the defending Persians an uphill advantage. You'll find that these will be two common themes throughout Alexander's most famous battles. Despite his disadvantages, Alexander ordered an immediate attack, one he would lead on the back of his trusted steed, Bucephalus. Alexander first ordered a portion of his companion cavalry, his prodromoi, and an infantry unit to attack the Persian army head-on. The Persians unleashed a volley of arrows and javelins onto the men while they waded through the river and up the shore. Predictably taking losses and struggling to climb the bank, the Macedonian units retreated back into the river. Emboldened, the Persian cavalry pursued them onto the river bank. This was the exact moment Alexander had been waiting for. Charging across the river, Alexander and Bucephalus led the companion cavalry towards the left flank of the Persians. The Persian cavalry, which was exposed and unequipped for close-quarters combat, began to crumble. Overwhelmed by the cavalry and a follow-through from the infantry, the Persian army fled.
It was bait.
Yep.
It was always bait.
Mm-hmm.
Imagine being like the most distinguished general of the Persian army and getting baited so hard like that.
Mm-hmm. I'm pretty sure he was actually Greek. I think
Oh,
he
that's
was
even
hired.
funnier.
Yeah, he was hired. He's like
Yeah, which was quite common at the time, wasn't it?
yes, yeah,
Yeah,
and yeah,
even
that's
funnier.
embarrassing.
Yeah, that is like going down as the guy who got baited by like a child.
Yes, and Alexander does it a lot.
Yeah, yeah. How very annoying. I mean, they
Somehow
didn't call
everyone
him.
falls for it. I don't know.
Yeah, they didn't call him the Great for nothing.
Hmm. The total defeat of Memnon's army left much of Asia Minor ripe for the taking. Alexander gained control of the region, establishing a supply line between his army and Macedonia. Darius III, the Achaemenid Empire's king at the time, was far from pleased. Taking leadership of his own army, Darius marched on Issus in 333 BCE in order to cut off Alexander's supply line. Once again, Alexander was not in a great position, pinned between a river and foothills. Macedonia's central infantry crossed the river and attempted to make headway up the bank, but experienced too many losses and was forced back. At the same time, the Persian cavalry charged the cavalry at the Macedonian army's left flank. It was Alexander leading an infantry on foot at the right flank that finally punched a hole through the Persian line. Alexander then mounted Bucephalus and, spotting Darius and his bodyguards, charged with his companion cavalry. Darius fled, and rather than pursue, Alexander turned to assist the central infantry and left flank cavalry. Eventually realizing that their king had left them, the remainder of the Persian army broke apart and fled.
Him returning probably also meant a lot to his. It's probably got a lot to do with why his men liked him so much. Because I think a lot of other young, arrogant men probably would have charged after him and been like, "Nope, this ends here," or like, "Nope, I want to be the person that gets your head," you know?
Mm-hmm. Yes, and this is another thing that Alexander would actually kind of commonly do. Like, he'd have the opportunity to, finish off their leader, but he would, when he'd have to choose between either kind of losing a large portion of his army or like defeating the leader, he would save the rest of his army.
Which says a lot. But also, I wonder if any part of it had to do with the fact that he was like, well, if they don't have their leader, they can't come back with another army that I can flatten again. He's
Maybe.
like, how am I going to get written down in the history books if I can't get at least 50 of these curb stomps under my belt?
I mean, yeah, he was in it for the long haul, so it's like... So he's like, well, also, it's like, if I lose a bunch of my guys, like, what's going to happen
It's
when
gonna be really hard to replace them.
Exactly. Yeah. One story that might be apocryphal, but it was, like, told by one historian who is kind of the source for a lot of these battles, like battle descriptions, is that after each battle, Alexander would go to his men and he'd like have them tell him like the story of their fight, and he'd sit down and listen, and he would like listen to their stories about their comrades who had fallen and stuff, and that meant a lot to his men, and that's like one of the reasons why they're so loyal to him. And it's like that might not necessarily be completely true, but also I could see that happening because he had a pretty small army, so I guess he had the time to talk to at least some of them.
Yeah. And all of those ones would go on to then tell the stories back to their other friends and
Exactly.
be like, he's the coolest guy I've ever met.
Mm-hmm. He's not like those other kings who think they're better than us.
Yeah. He hangs out with all of us.
Yeah. Well, that's also the other thing. Like, Alexander's always in the front leading the charge, so I can see how that gains respect as well. Alexander spent about 2 years claiming more land from the Achaemenid Empire, gaining allies, and consolidating resources. More land meant more resources, more men, and more horses. Since cavalry was crucial to his military success, Alexander was always on the lookout for more horses. In 331 BCE, Alexander and Bucephalus fought their next great battle, their last against the Persian army. The Battle of Gaugamela had a lot of players, as Darius had gathered all of his remaining mercenaries and allies for his last stand. Boiling down the battle to basics, Alexander ordered his infantry to hold the line as best as possible. Meanwhile, his left-wing cavalry fought Darius's... I keep going between Darius and Darius.
I think a lot of people do that.
Meanwhile, his left-wing cavalry fought Darius's Scythian allies to prevent them from flanking the Macedonians. Alexander, Bucephalus, and the companion cavalry waited for the exact moment to strike. In an attempt to weaken the companion cavalry, Darius sent in chariots. Chariots were old news to the Greek army at this point, and the cavalry simply outmaneuvered them and dispatched the drivers.
You can't really turn a chariot really quickly.
Exactly.
You could look like a dumbass sitting out there being like, turn! It's like a guy in a parking lot trying to do a 7-point backing out of his park. While three other people are just trying to get around him. Like, can you move?
Yeah, exactly. It's like, I could see how if you had like a phalanx and they're all just supposed to just stand there, and then you have a chariot run them over. That totally works.
For sure.
But in this case, like, the way they described it was that the chariots came charging at the cavalry, and the cavalry was just like, they just made lanes for them. So they just like went down the lanes, and then they were like,
oh.
Yeah.
Well, that was unsuccessful.
Yeah. That's why chariots went out of fashion.
Yeah.
Once again, Darius was exposed and in Alexander's sights. Once again, however, Alexander had to assist his cavalry. After a hard-fought battle, the Persian army fled and dispersed. Alexander was the new king of Persia. And by the way, Darius didn't last long after this battle. He was very unpopular.
The Persians loved killing their own kings.
Yeah.
They really loved doing that. It happened to a few of the Xerxes as well, I'm pretty sure, too.
Like, a lot of them died from assassination, including Darius.
Mm.
Alexander was not content with defeating the Achaemenid Empire, and in 330 BCE began riding eastward. Near the south shores of the Caspian Sea, Bucephalus and Alexander faced a delay in their conquest and a test of their relationship. Late one night, Bucephalus grazed in the meadows of the Caspian steppe with the rest of the companion cavalry's herd. Transporting hay and feed for horses was costly, and so land where the horses could graze freely was always a welcome sight. On this night, however, a flurry of activity whisked Bucephalus and a portion of the herd away. A group of Scythian raiders, called the Amardi, saw the opportunity for more high-quality horses and stole them. Unbeknownst to them, they had made the worst possible selection when leading away an old, stubborn Bucephalus.
Yeah, and he was old and grizzled at this point. He had seen some shit, and he was not gonna take any.
And it's like funny because it's like, you know, claimed many times that no one could ride Bucephalus except for Alexander. So I'm just like picturing like some of these guys being like, you know how like farm boys tend to all be the same, where they're like, oh, I can ride that, and then they get on him, and then he just like throws them.
Yeah, the entire scene from trying to break Spirit.
Yes,
just that like, movie sequence.
Yeah, that movie sequence happens. Then we pan back to Alexander. Alexander's rage when he discovered his old friend missing has gone down in legend as an overreaction to some, a justified reaction to others. I personally feel that it was justified, but that's just me being a horse person.
Yeah, if someone stole my horse, I'd also want to... No, never mind. I'm not going to say that out loud.
He vowed that not only would he kill or enslave every Amardi he came in contact with, he would also burn down every tree and field to render the land inhospitable. The raiders returned Bucephalus as soon as they could.
They said, whoa, we take it back, please slow down. We also don't want this jerk of a horse. Take him back, please.
Pretty much, yeah. He was like, this is not worth that. Like,
yeah, they're like, oh shit, we do not, this is not what we planned, not what we wanted.
I imagine, like, one way that I kind of picture it with the, like, Scythians is that, because, you know, they were horse people. And so there was probably a lot of this whole thing of, like, people stealing horses moving between lots of different people.
Oh, for sure.
And it's like, you probably definitely, like, formed a relationship with a horse. But, like, I think it was kind of one of those things where it's like, someone stole my horses. I should have watched them better. Darn. This really sucks, but you don't, like, threaten to destroy their entire
Alexander was
world.
Like, my son! Like that Harry Potter scene. My son! My only son!
Basically. Alexander's march was impeded by the Scythians once again in 329 BCE, this time on the shores of the Jaxartes River. We've covered the Scythians previously, and if you've listened to the episode, you know that the Scythians were not a single kingdom, but rather a collection of factions. In this case, Alexander came across the headstrong Saka. Their skilled cavalry specialized in speed and archery, a common strategy involving riding rings around slower infantry and picking them off with arrows. However, the Saka underestimated the range of Alexander's catapults. Macedonian artillery provided the covering fire needed for Alexander's forces to cross the river. The Saka likely would have withdrawn at this point, as was very common with the Scythians, but Alexander wanted to finish the job. He sent out a unit of cavalry, leaving himself exposed in order to provoke an attack. The Saka took the bait, charging Alexander.
Again.
Yep, once more. And this I, like, didn't understand at first when I was, like, reading it, because I was like, they have, like, an army right there. How did they not see them? I guess they hid, they hid below the riverbank, so they didn't know that they had as many guys as they did.
Yeah. They probably had a bunch of ways to hide or, like, fake numbers and stuff like that.
Yeah. So it's like the Saka weren't stupid, but they just didn't know they had that many guys. And also, like, for them, again, they weren't used to the whole using units as bait, like, at all. Because for them, it's like a lot of the times with the Scythians as well, it's like you would just have individuals who would come fight for one leader because they thought that was best for their own personal interests. But they weren't all that loyal to that leader necessarily. And so they would never agree to go be bait. So the Saka took the bait, charging Alexander and his companion cavalry. The remainder of the Macedonian army came flooding over the riverbed and surrounded the Saka, pitting them between two powerful forces. This strategy, called the hammer and anvil, was used often by Alexander. The whole immovable object and unstoppable force coming together.
Yep. And, like, it's like that thing of, like, people hadn't changed their tactics in 200 years, so people hadn't kept up with what he was doing. They didn't know how to fight it yet. Like, it was going to take years before that happened.
Yep. News of the Scythian defeat traveled swiftly. Soon, other Scythians came riding to join the Macedonian army in pursuit of riches and plunder. The army proceeded to march towards India for 3 more years, winning minor battles along the way.
It is very funny to me how many people get beaten and just go, you know what? Can't beat them? Join them. Let's go. You know what? Might not be so bad. Let's do this.
Yeah. And that's like how he got a lot of his, like, reinforcements, you know? Like, was just he picked up people along the way and, like, you know, these...
hey, you have a choice. you can team up with us or I'll cut your head off. Take a pick. And it's like, oh, I think I know what I'm going to pick. Let me go get my shit.
Yeah. Yeah, I didn't even get into Alexander's personal life with along here. He had so many wives, dude.
Oh, I don't even want to know.
Which is, yeah, it's not great.
Arrogant young man conquering the world. Yeah. He must have been a bundle of joy.
Yeah.
To be around. When it came to be... Well, I mean, for a woman, that is. Like, he must have been... Yeah. Alexander the fuckboy would have been...
Yes.
Maybe? was a close contender, actually, to Alexander the Great.
I imagine he was pretty similar to how, like, a lot of them were back then. Not saying that it's okay and fine, but, like... It's not like any of them were all that progressive back then. It was like,
Yep.
It was like you had the king, and at least like with Alexander's case, it's like he defeated Darius, and he was like, "I get your wife and I get your daughters." Which, yeah. Also, okay, one little side note. So the second battle, the one where he fought Darius at Issus. So Darius flees. And he left behind his wife and his daughters, his two daughters. So Alexander's army captured them. So then, yeah. So then Darius was like, "Hey, let's make peace." Like, he was like trying to negotiate with him and stuff. And he was like giving him all these offers. And he's like, "Let's make peace. I'll let you marry my daughter, one of my daughters." And Alexander was like, "Nope, I'm not taking the deal." And then he went and married his daughter anyway. And I think also married, like, her cousin at the same ceremony.
Oh, my God.
A 2-for-1 deal.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, why not speed up the process and just do both at the same time, hey?
Yeah, which is, yeah. I was, like, reading that. I was like, oh, wow. Also with the whole thing of, like, there's all this controversy that Alexander might have, like, his best friend might have also been his lover. And I'm just like, why are people so surprised? They're Greek.
Yeah.
They're
Greek. They were banging everyone and everything and marrying whoever the fuck they wanted.
Like, they literally compared each other to, like, him as Achilles, and then his best friend as, like, I forget his name, but Achilles' lover.
Patroclus. Yeah, it was
Patroclus. So they would compare, like, you don't do that with your best dude friend.
No.
Like, you don't go like, "Oh, you know who we're like? This power couple, but no homo."
Yeah. Not that I like you like that. No.
So yeah, bi icon, perhaps. Certain people wouldn't like me saying that, so. Not that I care, but...
Yeah, exactly.
In 326 BCE, King Porus of India barred Alexander's progress at the Hydaspes River. Perhaps the writing was on the wall at this point, or perhaps Alexander remained blissfully unaware, but this would be he and Bucephalus's last great battle. In addition to a cavalry and infantry, King Porus had a unit of war elephants. War elephants were akin to walking tanks at the time, carrying a howdah on their backs, which was like an armored box.
Also an upgrade for the Burmese in Age of Empires 2.
There we go.
It's the name of a unique technology that you can research. Good for
the
them.
howdah?
Yep. To be fair, the technology is just called howdah.
Is it pulled by an elephant?
It makes your elephant archers take reduced damage, I think it is.
Nice. Because, they just got a armored box on their back, yeah.
Yeah, it gives +1 melee armor and +1 pierce armor to battle elephants.
Nice.
Yep. Very cool.
Archers and javelin throwers fought from inside the howdah. Along with being powerful and large, war elephants spooked the Macedonian horses, so they needed to be attacked by infantry. I didn't write anything down about this, but just like reading about war elephants made me so sad considering what we know about elephants nowadays and how like you shouldn't even have a person riding on their back because they're not really designed for it. And it's just like they had to carry this heavy armor, multiple people on their backs, and they were just getting like hacked at by like weapons. And I'm just like, these poor elephants.
I can't remember what film it was that I watched a while ago that had like footage of an elephant being like speared 1 trillion times until it fell and died. And
That's
I was just like,
sad.
It's so miserable to watch, dude. Even if it's a CGI elephant, I'm crying, dude. You've lost me. I'm emotional over it. Nothing good ever came from circus animals. Nothing. Yeah. Nothing at all.
Yeah.
It's like the one elephant that had to be hanged, and they decided to hang it of all things. And it hung for like 8 hours or something, and it still wasn't dead, so they had to shoot it. And I was like, what, are you insane? Like, I know Victorians and Edwardians were insane, but like, are you insane?
They
like,
did
what?
Insane things to elephants, because also wasn't an elephant shocked, like electrified to death?
I think so, yeah. But I think it didn't work. Yeah, no, it was made into a 1903 black and white silent short.
Oh my god. That's terrible.
Yeah. That's right. The elephant's name was Topsy. I know this one. Yeah, it was on Coney Island that they did it. A reputation as being a bad elephant, having killed a drunken spectator the previous year who burnt the tip of her trunk with a lit cigar.
It's like, yeah, she killed him because he was hurting her. Of course she's
gonna kill him. Like, yeah, Topsy, Topsy was the one that they were gonna hang. That's it. So, yeah, so the American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, the SPCA, stepped in, questioning the idea of hanging an elephant as making a public spectacle out of the death of an animal. Thompson and Dundee cut the event back to invited guests and press only, and agreed to use a surer method of strangling the elephant with large ropes tied to a steam-powered winch. They also agreed they would use poison and electricity as well. So it was just miserable, the whole thing.
I know. Oh my god. It's a
74-second film. It opens with Topsy being led past a crowd of people through an unfinished Luna Park to an execution spot in the middle of a lagoon used for boat rides. It cuts. The film cuts, and intervening an hour and 45 minutes are not recorded. During this unrecorded interval, Topsy refused to cross the bridge to the island, forcing the park employees and Brooklyn Edison electricians to re-rig the strangling apparatus and the electrical wiring to where Topsy stood. Topsy was also fed carrots laced with cyanide, while copper-clad sandals connected to electric lines were strapped to her feet. This is so fucked the more I read it.
Yeah, this is so sad. Oh my god.
Yeah, it's bad. It's really bad. In popular culture, Thompson and Dundee's execution of Topsy has switched attribution, with narratives claiming the film depicts an anti-alternating current demonstration organised by Thomas Edison during the War of the Currents waged against his competitor George Westinghouse. This is a popular misconception. Edison was never at Luna Park, and the electrocution of Topsy took place 10 years after the War of Currents had already ended. Edison was in fact no longer attached to General Electric, which had been formed in a merger between Edison General Electric and the Thomas Houston Electric Company in 1892.
I see. It's because the Edison Film Company produced it. Everybody associates it with Edison still.
So the other one, the elephant that got hanged that I was thinking about was named Mary, and she was executed in 1916. So a little bit after this one.
Why are we so bad to elephants?
Bro. Also, like, in what world is the right thing to do to hang an elephant? Like, the amount of weight, like, crane that you need to hold that up, ugh.
Okay, this is a sad tangent we've gone on, and it's just...
Yeah, it is. Because Mary's story is not any better. Like, a guy antagonized her and she stepped on his head. Which is, like, fair enough. In her defense, again, they said there have been several accounts of his death. One recounted by W.H. Coleman, who claimed to be a witness, is that he prodded behind her ear with a hook after she reached down to nibble on a watermelon rind.
Well, because that's like a thing that they would use back then, is that they would use hooks to control them with pain and force. And it's like, it's just such a... No, I could go on and on about how terrible it is.
Yeah, it's humanity has not been kind to the elephant.
Seriously, which is crazy. It's like because we see something so big and powerful, and like there's a certain group of people who, whenever they come across something that is big and powerful and strong, they're like, I need to overpower that to prove how...
I need to kill it to prove that I'm better than it.
Yeah, or like control it. Like,
yeah.
Which is kind of how a lot of the like circus kind of stuff has been. It seems to be this big macho need to overpower and control something.
Yep.
Yes, war elephants were used in this battle. Do I approve? Not really, but you know, there's a lot of things back then that were messed up, so... Alexander's first move was to draw the Indian cavalry away from the rest of the Indian army. Sending one cavalry unit to one wing and leading his companion cavalry to the other, Alexander accomplished just this. Next, the Macedonian infantry marched against the Indian infantry and elephants. The Indian cavalry, outmatched and confused, fled into their own line of elephants, creating chaos. Alexander's armies surrounded the Indian army, once again employing the hammer and anvil technique. Alexander emerged victorious, but not without a price. Perhaps old and fatigued, or maybe gravely wounded in the battle, Bucephalus breathed his final breath following the Battle of Hydaspes. After 8 years and around 3,000 miles from home, Alexander said goodbye to one of his most devoted companions. In honor of his horse, Alexander founded the city of Alexandria Bucephalus on the shores of the Hydaspes River. The tomb of Bucephalus stands in Pakistan to this day as a monument to the great horse. This kind of reminded me a little bit of how you joked that the city of Lexington was named after Lexington the horse.
Yeah.
And we were like, I was like, that'd be funny.
It would be. It would be. And honestly, I would also, if I had a horse that did conquer the world for me, I would also name a lot of shit after that horse.
Mm-hmm.
But it would be awful because I would name the horse something stupid like my wife is playing a video game right now with a horse named Pebbles, and Pebbles is not a great name for a town. But it would be funny.
Is Oxhead really that great of a name?
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, but I mean, how many people know that that's what Bucephalus means?
True.
They might just be like, you know, like your better half, and you know, think that it means bronchitis or, you know.
Maybe you could just name Pebbles like that in Latin, and then boom, it sounds
exactly.
really,
really fancy and
cool.
Yeah, perfect.
Alexander and his army traveled further, but stopped at the Ganges River. They were sick, tired, nursing battle wounds, and so very far from home. Perhaps Alexander lost some of his fighting spirit when he lost Bucephalus. The army turned around to march home. Alexander never made it back to Macedonia, dying of disease or poisoning at the age of 32. His body rested in Alexandria, Egypt, before disappearing. Perhaps this is for the best, for Alexander to be an intangible legend, shrouded by mystery.
At that point, you know, it's one of those... I mean, you're that far from home, and it must have been terrifying to be the Indians at that point, though. Because it's like, you've just seen this massive army come through. They've beaten a huge chunk of what you thought was your strongest army.
Mm-hmm.
And like they're only plodding on. Like, they're only getting closer into your territory. Like,
mm-hmm.
what do you do? And then suddenly one day they pick up and turn around, and it's like, huh? Like, what are we supposed to, like, and that would be so confusing.
It's like, have you played Civ, like Civ 6?
No, I have not.
So, something that sometimes happens in that game is that you have, like, your scout out early in the game, at least for me. I'll have like my scout, and he's scouting around, and then I'll see in the distance like an enemy with like these enemy forces with like an army, and I'm like,
oh no,
uh-oh. And then they just like disappear, and I never see them again, and I'm like, interesting.
Yes, they gave up.
Yeah.
It's yeah, an interesting. It must have been mortifying. It must have been like, imagine all the Indian royalty sitting there going, "What do we do? What do we do? What do we do? How are we going to fight this? This is going to take everything. We need to march everyone over here and get ready to fight this thing." And then the next day, they just pick up and go.
That would be kind of weird and kind of awkward.
Yeah.
Because also, like, so King Porus had called for reinforcements, but they arrived late. And so Alexander captured those reinforcements and had those. So he had elephants at that point. He had, like, a pretty large army, like, from India. But I think it's just, like, you know, because so much of his success did stem from that loyalty that I had talked about before, it's like, what happens when that runs out?
It's like you're kind of shit out of luck at that point because, you know, everyone's tired. They want to go home. They want to see their homes again. They want to see their families again, and they probably won't.
I know, right?
And I think a lot of them would have known that. A lot of them would have been like, "It's going to take us years to get home, and I don't think I'm going to make it that far."
Yeah.
I would be surprised to know the number of them that did make it back. I'm pretty sure it wasn't many.
Yeah, that would be interesting to find out how many of them like were there from the beginning and made it all the way there and back.
Who took over from Alexander and got everyone home?
I'll have to look that up.
Also, like, he must have had a fair few kids by that stage, whether he knew it or not.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm like looking up stuff. I guess his son was born after Alexander died, which is interesting.
Oh.
But from...
Not what I expected.
Yeah, from Alexander's, like, wife Roxana, who I think was like his like real wife, like
yes,
the wife he actually like was like, this is the
one,
the wife,
the main hoe, TM, as he probably would have called her. I'm kidding. But it probably wouldn't have been anything respectful unless he was actually genuinely in love with her.
Okay, interesting. So Alexander dying was like a big issue within the army.
Oh, yeah.
Because
no one knew what the fuck to do.
Yeah, because Roxana was just pregnant, but they didn't know.
Yeah, and the line of succession would have been really, really muddied.
So the infantry wanted Alexander the Great's half-brother, Philip III. Oh, he had a cognitive disability throughout his life. The commander of the companion cavalry was like, hey, no, let's wait and hope that Roxana's child will be male. Which is kind of funny to me that they're like, okay, either our options are either this guy who has a disability affecting his cognitive function, or a literal infant,
newborn,
a newborn baby. Like, what?
That's cursed. That's cursed as fuck.
And then they were just like, hey, how about you, the commander of the companion cavalry? Why don't you
go and do that commanding thing?
Yeah, why don't you serve as regent until the child is born?
That's how you know that, like, people, like, knew how bad it was to be ruler. Like, that's the smart people. Like, the people who aren't, like, drunk on power and go, yeah, let me just be king regent for now, or, like, whatever, or prince regent, or whatever the fuck. Mm-hmm. And the smart ones that went, no, I don't want that fucking responsibility, lol.
Yeah. Yeah.
You're hilarious. Fuck that.
It's like, where they're like,
you want me to drag all these guys home and have someone look at me immediately and go, where the fuck is the rest of them?
Yeah.
Like, bitch, that's not my fault.
He's like, I know how to fight. I don't know how to rule, which...
I don't know how to get people home. What the fuck? Yeah. I followed Alexander and he took us so far from home and then died.
Because, yeah, basically there's a bunch of fighting. Everybody wanted the land. You know,
everyone was in charge.
Yeah, like, Alexander had just claimed all of this kingdom and land and then had not actually really done too much to...
He hadn't assigned anyone to actually keep it or do anything about it.
I think he did, but it's one of those things where he was just like, yeah, you rule. Anyway, bye. And it's
Bye.
like, if you're the boss of something and you just tell them to do something and then you don't ever check back in, like, physically on it, like, there's a
One
good...
of two things is going to happen. Nothing's going to go anywhere, or they're going to go in a complete different direction that isn't what he wanted.
Exactly. I mean, granted, I don't think the guy was planning to die at 32. That's pretty young. Even if you are... I mean, he probably felt pretty invincible, to be honest.
Yeah, probably. I mean, when you've won that many battles, you'd probably become pretty arrogant. Although, how did he die? It was it was like the infection thing, right? Like, or like he was just sick.
It's yeah.
Died disease or poisoning at the age of 32. Like,
yeah, it's very
they always
unclear.
They always die of such a lame way. That like it's like, how did they die? Oh, like influenza A, well,
Yeah.
influenza B, typhoid, like something really
it was
basic.
Funny when I told Jay about how Alexander died and how it wasn't sure, because I was like, well, they think certain historians think it was malaria, and so Jay like looks it up and he is like listing off the list of diseases that it could have been, and it's just this long ass list because it's like so many things. It could have been so many things. Like his symptoms were basically, that's the other thing, is that like there's two different records of his symptoms. One says that he had like a really bad fever, got sick over the course of some like weeks, and then died. And then another doesn't say any fever, but it does say that he was like in a lot of agonizing pain for a couple of days and then died, which would point more towards poisoning. Being poisoned is a little more sexy, I guess, than dying of
definitely
malaria.
One for the history books. Yeah, than dying of, exactly. Because it's like, at least then you can be like, oh, my enemies were cheap and they killed me with poison.
Yes, yeah. While the empire he created did not last long, the ripple effect of Alexander's conquest was felt throughout history. The intermingling of Greek and Indian culture can be seen in things like mythology, horsemanship, and cultural practices to this day. Countless cities named Alexandria still stand across the Middle East and Asia Minor. Much of the Roman Empire's exploits were inspired by the success of the Macedonians. Alexander's strategies are still studied by militaries today. To think that this all happened because a boy wanted to see the world with his horse. At the very beginning of part 1, we talked about the legend behind the meeting of Alexander and Bucephalus. Perhaps the reason for the trope's popularity is also why, despite being a violent warmonger, many people admire Alexander the Great. Because deep down, every horse person has a bit of that boy inside of their heart. A boy riding a horse with wild abandon towards the sun.
Thank you for listening to History from Horseback. We hope that you enjoyed this episode, and we are on TikTok, Instagram, and Facebook, so give us a follow for more historical horse content. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you out on the trail. It was devastating that she was a Tory, but she was also probably a Tory at the time because she was a landowner in Britain. So, which would have been very different. Also, like, hashtag I could change her if she was alive today, I promise.